how capitalism works that cannot be obtained by other means. I was struck by a comment that Edgeworth made in 1921. This is a nice quote. He was reviewing a book on Marxian economics, and he said, the importance of Marx's theories is wholly emotional. The importance of Marx's theories is entirely emotional. Now, I don't think that's true, but one cannot help but sense that the labor theory of value continues to exert something of a strong emotional pull that has, in my opinion, obscured Marx's genuine analytical contributions. And I think the difficulties operate on a couple of levels. On one level, on the level of how Marxian economists communicate with one another, differences over how Marx ought to be interpreted can sometimes be counterproductive in the following sense. He had not resolved to his own satisfaction many of the problems that he was working on. His failure to complete volumes 2 and 3 of Capital was due as much to this as to illness and the distraction of his political activities. To the extent that Marx had not fully worked out his own ideas on issues like the relationship between labor values and prices of production, no definitive reading of Marx is possible. But debates over such matters continue to absorb a good deal of intellectual energy. Now, I'm not saying that we should debate what Marx or Keynes or Ricardo or Smith really meant, as is sometimes put. These are interesting questions, and trying to tease out the answers to these questions is how we extract insight from the writers of the past. But what sometimes happens is that these kinds of questions, what did these people really mean? These kinds of questions get transformed into litmus tests for who's a true Marxist, or who's a true Keynesian, or who's a true post-Keynesian. And when that happens, they become actively harmful to useful discussion. A second difficulty is that the attachment to Marx's labor value analysis hinders communication with non-Marxian economists. And to mention one fairly stark example that many of us are familiar with, Joan Robinson tells us that Keynes, I'm quoting her, Keynes was allergic to Marx's writings. And what she meant was Marx's dialectical rhetoric, which Keynes found both impenetrable and aesthetically repellent. Even though there was a lot of overlap in terms of what they were trying to do theoretically, the value analysis was problematic for Keynes. The word exploitation originated in the morally neutral concept of exploitation, and it came to mean simply making the most effective use of a resource or an opportunity, and it still means that in some contexts. The word acquired a morally unsound connotation, in English at least, only in the mid-19th century. And that was about the time that Marx was beginning his economic studies. And it was when social reformers applied the word to human beings as opposed to objects or situations. In fact, Marx uses the word exploitation in this way. In his economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. He had read Ricardo by then, but his thinking on theoretical questions was still in an embryonic stage. The Poverty of Philosophy, which was written just 2 years later, exhibits a much more sophisticated grasp of theoretical economics and a deeper familiarity with Ricardo's work. So by the time of his critique of Proudhon, Marx had arrived at many of the essential elements of his account of exploitation. For example, he recognized that workers can be exploited because they've been alienated from the means of production through a historical process of expropriation and technological transformation. This insight and the method of analysis by which he arrived at it are impressive scientific achievements. But this is the point here. They have nothing to do with the labor value analysis of capital. Marx did not formulate that labor value analysis until at least a decade and a half later, but he's still using the concept of exploitation in the way that we're familiar with it much earlier than that. So what then was the function of value analysis? The answer lies in the efforts of Marx's classical predecessors to explain the rate of profit. And I don't need to go into that. We're all familiar here with the problems posed by interdependence of prices and distribution, and how the labor value analysis of Ricardo and then Marx provided a way to out of that difficulty. Ricardo developed his labor embodied approach to address this technical problem. Marx confronted the same problem, and as with Ricardo, his labor value analysis is largely a technical device designed to isolate an objective relationship between wages and the profit rate. And this was a relationship that he was not equipped to expose by other means. Barclay Rosser told me a few years ago that the mathematics for solving systems of simultaneous equations actually had been developed in the late 18th century. So the tools were there, but certainly Ricardo and Marx did not have access to them. We're not familiar with them. The only route at their disposal to isolating this relationship between wages and the profit rate was labor value analysis. But this labor value analysis was not necessary to demonstrate that capitalist production relations generate profits through exploitation. Exploitation occurs when capitalists appropriate part of the net output that workers produce. This is a self-evident feature of capitalism. There's no need for a special analytical device to establish the presence of the phenomenon. Nor does one need to express one's accounts in terms of labor time in order to show that capitalist exploitation is sociologically complex, or that it inflicts on workers a historically specific form of alienation. You can do all that without labor values. On matters of structure, the approaches of Marx and Ricardo hardly differ from one another at all. One way I sometimes describe the distinction is that Ricardo makes a possibly questionable empirical assumption, i.e. that commodities exchange more or less in proportion to embodied labor times, whereas Marx makes a certainly indefensible theoretical assertion, which is that the normal rate of profit is equal to and determined by the ratio of surplus labor to the labor time embodied in constant and variable capital. This brings us next to the question of how Marx constitutes an advance over Ricardo. Right? If on this technical issue they're very much akin to one another, is Marx an advance over Ricardo? If so, how? Well, I think there are several dimensions of Marx's work that carry our understanding of economic and historical processes forward in significant ways, and I'll mention them. There's first of all the method of historical materialism and the associated idea that the evolution of the mode of production shapes the ideological, cultural, scientific, and institutional structure of a society.